The events of October 7th, 2023, and Israel's overwhelming response in Gaza have shattered any illusion that the status quo can continue. Decades of managing, not resolving, the conflict have failed, leaving both Israelis and Palestinians in a cycle of trauma and violence. Now the region faces a stark choice: continue down a catastrophic path or confront the hard questions leaders have long avoided. Veteran journalist Akiva Eldar's analysis points to painful but necessary sacrifices on both sides as the only way forward. The children of both peoples deserve a future beyond checkpoints and bomb shelters. The time for decisive action is now. The alternative, endless conflict, is simply too dire to accept. Akiva Eldar's enlightened Zionism begins with a hard truth. The occupation since 1967 has eroded Israeli democracy. In the West Bank, settlers live under civil law, while millions of Palestinians remain under military rule, an unstable, unjust duality. Security is vital, but Eldar argues lasting safety can't come from dominating another people. Israel's future as a Jewish and democratic state depends on ending the occupation and enabling Palestinian self-determination. The occupation undermines democracy, fuels extremism, and isolates Israel internationally. Eldar's work frames the choice: keep the land, or keep Israel's democratic soul. October 7th has made this choice impossible to ignore. October 7th exposed the failure of Israel's security doctrine and the illusion that the conflict could be managed indefinitely. Israel's military response in Gaza has created a humanitarian catastrophe and deepened trauma on both sides. The West Bank faces rising settler violence and military operations, making peace seem ever more distant. Eldar warns of two futures: permanent apartheid or endless cycles of violence. The comfortable middle ground is gone. Only hard choices remain. Courage and political will are now urgently needed. 6 decades of occupation have corroded Israeli democracy, forcing contradictions at the heart of the state. Emergency laws and military orders in the West Bank seep into Israel proper, eroding legal standards and public debate. The Supreme Court's justifications for occupation have damaged its credibility and divided the legal community. The settler movement, once fringe, now wields major political power, blocking compromise and pulling Israel further from its founding values. Israel's dual identity, liberal democracy for Jews, military occupier for Palestinians, is unsustainable. The longer the occupation continues, the more democracy is threatened. Israel must choose the territories or a robust democracy. It cannot have both. The West Bank's dual legal system is institutionalized discrimination. Settlers under civil law, Palestinians under military law. Settlers enjoy full rights and state support. Palestinians face military courts, movement restrictions, and no political agency. The same offense yields different outcomes depending on ethnicity. A mockery of equality before the law. This system isn't temporary. It's designed to entrench control and expand settlements. Palestinian land is fragmented into disconnected enclaves, undermining any hope for a viable state. The dual legal system fuels resentment and violence, making peace ever more elusive. It's not just law, it's demographic and geographic engineering on the ground. Beyond the political and legal ramifications, the occupation exacts a heavy moral and psychological toll on both Israelis and Palestinians, a cost that is often overlooked in geopolitical analysis. For Palestinians, generations have now grown up knowing nothing but the daily indignities of occupation. The constant presence of soldiers, the fear of night raids, the demolition of homes, and the inability to move freely create a pervasive atmosphere of trauma and hopelessness. This lived experience has a profound impact on mental health, community cohesion, and the aspirations of young people. When a political solution appears perpetually out of reach, desperation can easily curdle into extremism, creating a fertile ground for militant groups who promise resistance through violence. For Israelis, particularly the young soldiers tasked with enforcing the occupation, the moral cost is also significant. These 18 and 19-year-old conscripts are placed in an impossible situation, forced to wield immense power over a civilian population. They are ordered to carry out tasks like manning checkpoints, dispersing protests, and conducting arrests, actions that inevitably involve conflict and moral compromise. Organizations like Breaking the Silence, comprised of veteran soldiers, have provided powerful testimony about how these experiences can lead to a numbing of empathy, moral injury, and psychological distress. This process desensitizes a segment of the population to the suffering of the other, making reconciliation and peace even more difficult to achieve. This moral corrosion also impacts the broader Israeli society. To sustain the occupation, a narrative must be maintained that dehumanizes Palestinians, portraying them not as a people with legitimate national aspirations, but primarily as a security threat. This narrative is reinforced in parts of the media, the education system, and political rhetoric, creating a psychological barrier that prevents many Israelis from seeing the full human cost of the occupation. It fosters a society where the plight of people living just a few miles away can be rendered invisible. This willful blindness is a defense mechanism, but it comes at the cost of the society's own moral compass and its capacity for empathy and justice. Ultimately, the occupation creates a reality where violence becomes normalized for both peoples. For Palestinians, resistance, both violent and nonviolent, becomes a natural response to subjugation. For Israelis, the use of overwhelming force becomes an accepted and often demanded tool for maintaining control and ensuring security. This dynamic traps both societies in a self-perpetuating cycle of action and reaction, where each side's violence is seen as a justified response to the other's provocations. This toxic psychological environment is perhaps the most insidious effect of the occupation, poisoning the well of human decency and making the very idea of a shared, peaceful future seem like a naive and unattainable dream. The horrific and brutal events of October 7, 2023, represent far more than a tragic loss of life. They signify the complete and utter collapse of a security doctrine that had guided Israeli policy for over a decade. Hamas's meticulously planned and savagely executed attack, which claimed the lives of over 1,200 Israelis and saw 240 people dragged into Gaza as hostages, was a catastrophic failure of intelligence and military preparedness on a scale unseen in 50 years. This event was not merely a security breach, it was a profound violation of the most fundamental contract between the Israeli state and its citizens, the promise of protection within their own homes. The psychological impact of this failure has been deep and lasting, shaking the nation's sense of invulnerability to its very core. The attack shattered a number of deeply held illusions that had become comfortable articles of faith for many Israeli leaders and a large portion of the public. The primary illusion was that technology could serve as a substitute for a political solution. Israel had invested billions in a high-tech border fence, complete with sensors, cameras, and remote-controlled machine guns, believing it could hermetically seal off the Gaza Strip. The belief was that a combination of technological superiority and periodic military operations, known as mowing the lawn, could effectively manage the threat from Hamas indefinitely. October 7th proved, in the most brutal way imaginable, that human determination, however malevolent, can overcome any technological barrier when the underlying political grievances remain unaddressed. Furthermore, the attack exposed the moral and strategic bankruptcy of the belief that the Palestinian issue could be sidelined and ignored, while Israel pursued normalization with the wider Arab world. The prevailing logic, particularly championed by the government in power, was that peace could be achieved with Arab states without making any meaningful concessions to the Palestinians. The Abraham Accords were hailed as proof of this new paradigm. However, October 7th served as a violent and undeniable reminder that the Palestinian conflict remains the central, unresolved wound in the region. It demonstrated that no amount of regional diplomacy can create lasting stability as long as millions of Palestinians live under occupation or blockade without hope for a political future. This shattering of doctrines has created a vacuum of thought and strategy. The old assumptions have been proven disastrously wrong, but a new coherent strategy has yet to emerge. The initial response has been one of overwhelming military force, driven by an understandable desire for retribution and to restore a sense of security. However, this response does not address the fundamental political questions that the attack laid bare. The events of October 7th have forced a painful reckoning, stripping away the comforting illusions and leaving Israel to confront the stark reality that there is no military-only solution to a deeply political problem. The path forward remains dangerously unclear, clouded by grief, anger, and profound uncertainty about the future. Israel's military response to the October 7th attacks, while explained by the government as a necessary war to dismantle Hamas and secure the return of hostages, has unleashed a humanitarian catastrophe in the Gaza Strip of almost unimaginable proportions. The scale and intensity of the bombing campaign, followed by a ground invasion, have been unprecedented in the long history of the conflict. Entire neighborhoods have been reduced to rubble, and critical infrastructure, including hospitals, schools, universities, and bakeries, has been damaged or destroyed. The objective of eliminating Hamas has been pursued with a level of force that has inevitably had a devastating impact on the 2.3 million civilians trapped within the besieged enclave, the vast majority of whom have no connection to the militant group. The human cost of the war has been staggering, creating a crisis that has shocked the global conscience. According to health authorities in Gaza, the death toll has climbed past 40,000 people, a significant percentage of whom are women and children. Beyond the sheer number of fatalities, the conditions for the living have become utterly desperate. The vast majority of the population has been forcibly displaced from their homes, many of them multiple times, and are now crowded into makeshift camps with inadequate shelter, sanitation, and clean water. The healthcare system has all but collapsed, and the spread of disease is rampant. Widespread starvation and malnutrition are now a reality, creating a multi-generational crisis. This unfolding catastrophe has led to Israel's increasing isolation on the international stage. While many nations initially expressed solidarity with Israel after the horror of the October 7th attacks, the global sentiment has shifted dramatically in the face of the overwhelming Palestinian civilian death toll and the dire humanitarian situation. Israel now faces accusations of genocide in the International Court of Justice and arrest warrants for its leaders from the International Criminal Court. The widespread global outrage, fueled by round-the-clock imagery of suffering in Gaza, has put immense pressure on Israel's allies, including the United States, and has renewed an intense international focus on the fundamental injustices of the broader conflict that have been ignored for far too long. The deep and collective trauma being inflicted upon the Palestinian people in Gaza will have profound and lasting consequences that will reverberate for generations. For an entire generation of young Gazans, their formative experience will be one of death, destruction, and displacement at the hands of the Israeli military. This experience is almost certain to breed deep-seated hatred and a desire for revenge, potentially fueling cycles of violence for decades to come. While the military campaign may succeed in degrading Hamas's capabilities in the short term, the long-term strategic outcome may be the creation of an even more radicalized and desperate population, making any future prospect for peace and reconciliation seem more remote than ever before. While the world's attention has been overwhelmingly focused on the war and humanitarian crisis in Gaza, a parallel and equally dangerous crisis has been rapidly escalating in the occupied West Bank. This crisis, largely unfolding away from the international media spotlight, threatens to ignite a third front in the conflict and makes the prospect of a future peace agreement exponentially more difficult. Since October 7th, there has been a dramatic and alarming intensification of violence by extremist Israeli settlers against Palestinian civilians. This is not random violence. It is often systematic and appears aimed at exploiting the chaos of the war to advance a long-standing goal, the forcible displacement of Palestinians from their land, particularly in Area C of the West Bank. The statistics paint a grim picture of this escalating crisis. Human rights organizations have documented a massive surge in settler attacks, including shootings, physical assaults, the burning of homes and vehicles, and the destruction of olive groves, which are a crucial source of income for many Palestinian families. Entire Palestinian communities, particularly in the South Hebron Hills and the Jordan Valley, have been forcibly displaced under the threat of violence. This has occurred with what can only be described as the implicit or explicit acquiescence of the Israeli military. In many documented cases, Israeli soldiers have been present during settler attacks and have either failed to intervene to protect Palestinians or have actively supported the aggressors, creating a climate of total impunity. Simultaneously, the Israeli military has significantly increased its own operations throughout the West Bank. Nightly raids into Palestinian cities, refugee camps, and towns have become a regular occurrence, leading to hundreds of Palestinian deaths and thousands of arrests since October 7th. The stated goal of these operations is to preempt terror attacks and dismantle militant networks. However, the heavy-handed tactics and high number of casualties, including many civilians, have further inflamed tensions and deepened Palestinian anger and despair. The combination of unchecked settler violence and intensified military actions has created an atmosphere of constant fear and oppression, effectively putting the entire Palestinian population of the West Bank under a collective lockdown. This escalating crisis in the West Bank is systematically destroying the last vestiges of hope for a two-state solution. Every new illegal settlement outpost that is established, every Palestinian family that is driven from their land, and every violent confrontation further fragments Palestinian territory and poisons the environment for any future negotiations. The failure of the Israeli government to rein in settler extremists and protect the Palestinian civilian population under its control is not just a dereliction of its duties under international law. It is a direct assault on the possibility of a peaceful future. The fire in Gaza has captured the world's attention, but the embers smoldering in the West Bank threaten to erupt into an equally devastating conflagration. The dramatic escalation of settler violence in the West Bank since October 7th represents what Akiva Eldar would characterize as a direct and premeditated assault on the foundations of Israeli democracy and the principle of the rule of law. This is not simply a matter of criminal activity by a few rogue individuals on the fringes of society. Instead, it is a widespread phenomenon involving ideologically driven groups who are actively challenging the state's monopoly on the use of force. These acts of violence, which include brutal attacks on Palestinian homes, the systematic destruction of ancient olive groves, and the intimidation of shepherds, are occurring with an alarming frequency and brazenness that suggests a belief that they are above the law and will face no consequences. This wave of violence constitutes a profound test for Israel's legal and security institutions. A democratic state is defined by its ability and willingness to enforce the law equally for all people under its jurisdiction, without regard to their ethnicity or religion. When settlers can attack Palestinians with near total impunity, while any Palestinian act of violence is met with the full force of the military, the very concept of a just legal system collapses. This creates a reality of selective law enforcement that is fundamentally incompatible with democratic principles. The ongoing failure to hold violent settlers accountable erodes public trust in the legal system and signals that the state sanctions such behavior, even if unofficially. The implications of this breakdown in the rule of law extend far beyond the hills of the West Bank. It empowers the most extreme anti-democratic forces within Israeli society, who see violence as a legitimate tool for achieving their political goals. When these actions go unpunished, it normalizes political violence and creates a dangerous precedent that could eventually be turned against the Israeli state itself, its officials, or Jewish citizens who oppose the settlers' agenda. The line between nationalist vigilantism and domestic terrorism becomes perilously blurred, threatening the internal cohesion and stability of the nation. It is a classic case of the methods of occupation seeping back to corrupt the occupier. Therefore, confronting settler violence is not merely about protecting Palestinians, though that is a critical moral and legal obligation under international law. It is also about defending the democratic character of the State of Israel. The current situation presents a stark choice. Either the government will assert its authority and enforce the law without exception, proving its commitment to democratic norms, or it will continue to tolerate this lawlessness, thereby accelerating its own slide away from the democratic values it claims to uphold. The violence in the West Bank is a symptom of a deeper political sickness that threatens the entire democratic project. The crisis of settler violence is sustained and enabled by what can only be described as a pervasive climate of official impunity. This is not a situation of simple neglect by law enforcement. Rather, it is a systemic failure where various arms of the state appear to be complicit through their actions, or more often, their deliberate inaction. Numerous documented incidents from human rights organizations, both Israeli and international, show Israeli soldiers standing by as settlers attack Palestinians and their property. In some cases, soldiers have been documented actively participating, arresting the Palestinian victims of the attacks or providing cover for the assailants. This creates a reality where the very forces meant to provide security are instead perceived as facilitating the violence. The legal system further reinforces this impunity. Investigations into settler attacks are notoriously rare, and when they are opened, they are often closed without any indictments due to alleged lack of evidence or other bureaucratic justifications. The probability of a complaint filed by a Palestinian against a settler leading to a conviction is vanishingly small. This stands in stark contrast to the military justice system applied to Palestinians, where arrests are frequent and conviction rates are extraordinarily high. This dual standard sends a clear and unambiguous message to extremist settlers. Their actions carry little to no personal risk, which only emboldens them to commit more frequent and more severe acts of violence. This climate of impunity is not an accident. It is the logical outcome of a political environment where key government figures openly support the settlement enterprise and often offer rhetorical cover for the actions of the most extreme settlers. When ministers in the government describe these violent actors as pioneers or heroes and advocate for policies that would further entrench the settlements and displace Palestinians, it creates a powerful top-down signal that their actions are aligned with the state's broader, if unstated, objectives. This political backing effectively neuters any serious attempt by law enforcement or the military to crack down on the phenomenon, as they are reluctant to act against those with powerful political patrons. Consequently, the solution to settler violence must begin with a fundamental shift in official policy and political will. It requires the Israeli government to enforce its own laws without exception, making a clear and public commitment to do so. This means that soldiers and police officers must be given unambiguous orders to protect all civilians, Palestinian and Israeli alike, and to arrest any Israeli citizen who commits a violent crime. It demands that the justice system prosecutes settlers who commit violence with the same vigor and resources applied to Palestinian attackers. Without dismantling this architecture of impunity, any attempt to curb the violence will remain a futile public relations exercise. It is a profound mistake to view the surge in settler violence as a series of random, unconnected acts of rage or hooliganism. As Akiva Eldar's analysis would suggest, there is often a clear strategic logic behind the chaos: the forcible displacement of Palestinian communities to clear land for settlement expansion. This violence is frequently targeted and systematic, concentrating on small, vulnerable shepherding communities in Area C of the West Bank, which is the 60% of the territory under full Israeli military and civil control. The goal is to make daily life so dangerous, so terrifying, and so economically unsustainable for these Palestinian families that they have no choice but to abandon their ancestral lands and move to the more crowded Palestinian cities in areas A and B. This strategy of displacement is brutally effective. By attacking shepherds, poisoning livestock, destroying water cisterns, and blocking access to grazing lands, settlers can systematically dismantle the local Palestinian economy. By conducting nighttime raids, throwing stones at homes, and physically assaulting residents, they create an atmosphere of constant terror, particularly for children. When these actions are combined with the lack of protection from the Israeli military, families eventually reach a breaking point. Since October 7th, numerous entire communities, some of which have existed for decades, have been forced to pack their belongings and flee, effectively ceding their land to the nearby settlements without a single official eviction order being issued. This process represents a form of de facto creeping annexation of territory. It achieves the goals of the most extreme elements of the settler movement without the international condemnation that would accompany a formal government declaration of annexation. It is a guerrilla war for land, fought not by soldiers in uniform, but by civilian ideologues, creating facts on the ground that make a future two-state solution based on the 1967 lines increasingly impossible. Every Palestinian community that is erased from the map of Area C is another nail in the coffin of a viable and contiguous Palestinian state, which is precisely the long-term strategic objective of this campaign of violence. Therefore, addressing settler violence cannot be separated from the broader political issue of the settlement enterprise itself. As long as the Israeli government incentivizes and supports the expansion of settlements in occupied territory, it creates the conditions that make this violence almost inevitable. A sustainable solution requires not just prosecuting individual perpetrators, but fundamentally rethinking Israel's entire settlement policy. It demands dismantling illegal outposts immediately and preventing the establishment of new ones. Ultimately, it requires a commitment to reversing the settlement project in areas that would be essential for a future Palestinian state, recognizing that the violence is not just a crime, but a political tool. The path forward, emerging from the wreckage of October 7th and the ensuing war, must begin with a foundational and mutual acknowledgement that both peoples, Israelis and Palestinians, possess legitimate and undeniable national aspirations that deserve recognition and ultimate fulfillment. This is the essential starting point that has been missing from so many failed diplomatic efforts. It means unequivocally accepting that the Israeli people have the right to live in security and with dignity in their recognized sovereign homeland. In parallel, it means accepting with equal conviction that the Palestinian people have the very same right to self-determination, sovereignty, and statehood in a homeland of their own, free from occupation and external control. Despite its current unpopularity among both Israeli and Palestinian publics, who are deeply traumatized and disillusioned, the two-state solution remains the only realistic framework capable of satisfying the core needs and national narratives of both peoples. The alternatives are simply unworkable and lead to perpetual strife. However, for this solution to have any chance of success, it cannot be a mere resuscitation of previous iterations that collapsed under the weight of their own ambiguities and failures. A new two-state paradigm must be envisioned, one that directly and courageously addresses the fundamental issues of justice, security, viability, and sovereignty that were previously postponed or ignored, leading to years of stagnation and renewed violence. A viable and sovereign Palestinian state, which must be the ultimate goal of any renewed process, cannot be a collection of disconnected cantons or a state in name only. It must possess genuine territorial contiguity, allowing for freedom of movement and economic cohesion across its territory in the West Bank and Gaza. It must have meaningful sovereignty, which includes full control over its own borders, its airspace, and its precious natural resources, particularly water. This fundamentally requires a full Israeli withdrawal from the vast majority of the West Bank, a move that would necessitate the difficult and painful evacuation of tens of thousands of settlers from dozens of settlements scattered deep within the territory. This withdrawal would not necessarily have to be a complete return to the pre-1967 lines. The principle of minor and mutually agreed-upon land swaps could be implemented to allow for Israel to annex some of the largest settlement blocks located closest to the Green Line, where the majority of settlers reside. In exchange, the state of Palestine would receive equivalent tracts of land from within Israel, ensuring that the territorial exchange is fair and allows for the creation of a viable and cohesive state. This pragmatic approach acknowledges the demographic realities created over decades while still preserving the fundamental principle of a two-state solution based on the 1967 borders. For any agreement to be acceptable to the Israeli people, especially after the deep trauma of October 7th, it really must provide absolute, ironclad, and verifiable security guarantees. The fear that a future Palestinian state could become a launchpad for attacks against Israel is, honestly, the single greatest obstacle to be overcome in Israeli public opinion. So, any final status agreement would have to include the comprehensive and permanent demilitarization of the Palestinian state. This means that Palestine would have a strong, professional security force for internal policing, but it just wouldn't possess any heavy offensive weaponry, things like tanks, combat aircraft, or artillery, that could pose a strategic threat to Israel's existence. These security arrangements would, of course, need to be buttressed by robust international involvement. That could take the form of an international security force, maybe led by the United States or NATO, deployed along the borders of the new Palestinian state, particularly in the Jordan Valley, to prevent smuggling and external threats. Such a force would serve as a tripwire and a guarantor for both sides, making sure Palestinian sovereignty is respected while Israeli security is maintained. These guarantees, honestly, have to be seen as credible and long-term by the Israeli public. We're talking about moving beyond mere promises on paper to concrete and observable realities on the ground, things that can build trust over time. Now, on the Palestinian side, the sacrifices required are just as profound and emotionally charged. A final agreement would necessitate a pragmatic and just resolution to the issue of Palestinian refugees, one that acknowledges both the deep suffering of the refugees and the demographic concerns of Israel. While the right of return is a core tenet of the Palestinian narrative, A literal return of millions of descendants of refugees to modern-day Israel is a demographic impossibility that Israel will never accept. The solution would likely involve a combination of compensation, resettlement in the new state of Palestine, and the option for a symbolic, limited number to return to Israel proper under a family reunification framework. Furthermore, a lasting peace requires the Palestinian leadership to unequivocally recognize Israel's right to exist as the homeland of the Jewish people, just as Israel must recognize Palestine as the homeland of the Palestinian people. This kind of mutual recognition is the psychological cornerstone of a true and lasting peace. It moves beyond a tactical ceasefire to a genuine end of claims and an end of conflict. For Palestinians, this means formally relinquishing any claim to the territory that constitutes the State of Israel within its recognized borders. This is, without a doubt, a monumental and painful compromise, but it's the necessary price for achieving their own independent and sovereign state. The issue of Jerusalem, with its immense religious and political significance to both peoples, remains one of the most explosive and difficult obstacles to a final agreement. A winner-takes-all approach to the city is, honestly, a surefire recipe for perpetual conflict. So, any viable solution must really embrace the principle that Jerusalem should serve as the capital of two states. A practical and just arrangement would see West Jerusalem as the recognized capital of Israel and East Jerusalem as the recognized capital of Palestine. This would allow both peoples to realize their national aspirations within the city they both hold so sacred, transforming it from a point of friction into a symbol of coexistence. The Old City, with its holy sites that are precious to Jews, Christians, and Muslims worldwide, requires an even more creative and sensitive arrangement. Establishing hard borders within the ancient walls is just impractical and, frankly, undesirable. Instead, a special international or joint administrative regime could be established to govern the Old City, ensuring freedom of access and worship for all faiths. Sovereignty over the holy sites themselves, like the Temple Mount or Haram al-Sharif in the Western Wall, could be shared or divided functionally, with each side maintaining control over its respective religious sites under this overarching special status, guaranteed by the international community. Beyond the final status issues, the immediate implementation of any new peace process really requires a fundamental reform of Palestinian leadership. The current Palestinian Authority has lost nearly all credibility and legitimacy with its own people, mainly due to perceptions of corruption, ineffectiveness, and security collaboration with the occupation. For any peace process to succeed, it just has to be led by a Palestinian leadership that has a clear democratic mandate from its people and is genuinely committed to a strategy of nonviolence and a two-state outcome. This will likely require new, free, and fair presidential and legislative elections across the West Bank and Gaza as a precursor to serious negotiations. This process of Palestinian renewal must also include constitutional reforms that ensure greater transparency, accountability, and the rule of law within Palestinian institutions. The international community has a crucial role to play in supporting this process, not by imposing leaders, but by helping to create the conditions for democratic renewal. A reformed and revitalized Palestinian leadership would not only be a more credible partner for peace negotiations with Israel, but would also be better equipped to govern effectively and build the institutions of a future state, thereby giving its own people a tangible stake in the success of the peace process. The international community, and particularly global powers like the United States and the European Union, bear a significant degree of responsibility for the current crisis. Decades of failed diplomacy, inconsistent policies, and the application of double standards have contributed to the political stagnation that made the violence of October 7th and its aftermath almost inevitable. For far too long, the international approach has been one of conflict management rather than conflict resolution, allowing the core issues to fester while paying lip service to a two-state solution that was steadily being eroded on the ground. The catastrophic failure of this approach demands a fundamental shift in international strategy, from passive mediation to active intervention aimed at creating the conditions for a lasting peace. This new approach must begin with immediate, decisive action to de-escalate the current crises on all fronts. In the West Bank, this means the international community must move beyond mere condemnation and take concrete steps to protect Palestinian civilians. The deployment of international observers, or a protection force throughout the territory, should be seriously considered. Their presence would serve to monitor and report on violations by all parties, but also to act as a deterrent, reducing the climate of impunity that allows extremist violence to flourish. This is not about taking sides. It's about upholding international law and preserving the basic human security necessary for any political process to begin. Strategic economic pressure and incentives must be deployed with far greater purpose and consistency. Countries that genuinely support a two-state solution should align their economic policies with their political statements. This could involve implementing targeted sanctions on individuals and entities involved in settlement expansion and settler violence, as well as restricting the import of products originating from Israeli settlements in the occupied territories. At the same time, economic and developmental support for Palestinian institutions that are committed to democratic reform, nonviolence, and building a viable state should be significantly increased. This creates a clear set of consequences for actions that undermine peace and tangible rewards for steps that advance it. For the United States, this requires a significant recalibration of its traditional role. Unwavering American support for Israel's security has to be balanced with genuine, sustained pressure on Israeli governments to halt and reverse settlement expansion and end the occupation. The blank check of the past has enabled policies that have made peace more distant. A true friend tells a friend when they are on a self-destructive path. Likewise, European criticism of Israeli policies must be matched with concrete actions and a greater willingness to support Palestinian institution building in a way that fosters good governance and democratic legitimacy, rather than simply funding the status quo of the Palestinian Authority. The resolution of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict cannot be achieved in a vacuum. It is inextricably linked to the broader geopolitical dynamics of the Middle East. The current crisis has highlighted the dangers of regional actors who seek to exploit the conflict for their own ends. Iran's long-standing support for Hamas, Hezbollah, and other militant groups represents a direct and ongoing threat to any peace process. Tehran's strategy is to use these proxies to bog Israel down in perpetual conflict, destabilize pro-Western Arab governments, and prevent any regional integration that excludes it. Countering this malign influence is a critical component of creating a secure environment for Israeli-Palestinian peace to take root. However, the changing regional landscape also presents new and powerful opportunities. The Abraham Accords, which saw several Arab nations normalize relations with Israel, demonstrated a significant shift in regional priorities. While these agreements were controversial for bypassing the Palestinian issue, they proved that historic Arab-Israeli peace is possible when mutual strategic and economic interests align. The challenge now is to leverage this new dynamic to advance rather than ignore the cause of Palestinian statehood. Sustainable regional peace cannot be built on the continued disenfranchisement of the Palestinian people. Their inclusion is a prerequisite for long-term stability for all. The potential for Saudi Arabia to normalize relations with Israel represents a unique and potentially transformative regional game-changer. Crucially, the Saudi leadership has made it clear that any such deal is contingent on tangible, irreversible progress toward the creation of a viable Palestinian state. This linkage creates a powerful incentive for Israel. The prize of normalization, with the custodian of Islam's two holiest sites and the undisputed leader of the Arab and Sunni Muslim world, is immense. It would grant Israel unprecedented regional acceptance and unlock vast economic and security cooperation. This provides the international community, particularly the United States, with powerful leverage to press for the necessary Israeli compromises on Palestinian sovereignty. A comprehensive regional peace agreement offers the best path toward lasting stability. Imagine a grand bargain where, in exchange for the creation of a demilitarized Palestinian state with its capital in East Jerusalem, Israel receives full recognition, open borders, and security cooperation from the entire Arab League. Such an agreement, backed by Saudi Arabia and other key Arab states, could help legitimize the difficult compromises required from both Israelis and Palestinians. It would provide the economic resources to rebuild Gaza and support the new Palestinian state, while creating a united regional front to contain Iranian aggression. This vision transforms the Israeli-Palestinian issue from a source of regional instability into a cornerstone of a new, more peaceful Middle East. The international community's role must fundamentally shift from one of crisis management to one of active resolution. For decades, the default approach has been to manage the flare-ups of violence, provide humanitarian aid after each round of fighting, and then allow the situation to return to an unsustainable and unjust status quo. This cycle has been disastrous. It has allowed the physical and political space for a two-state solution to shrink continuously while breeding despair and extremism on both sides. The sheer scale of the current catastrophe must serve as the final, tragic proof that this policy of management has failed. The focus must now be on driving a political process toward a definitive end-of-conflict agreement. This requires the consistent and impartial application of international law. The international legal framework, including United Nations Security Council resolutions and the Geneva Conventions, provides a clear basis for a two-state settlement. These principles must be upheld for all parties. This means holding Palestinian militants accountable for acts of terror and violations of humanitarian law. It also means holding Israel accountable for its obligations as an occupying power, including the prohibition on settlements and the duty to protect the civilian population. The investigations by the International Criminal Court and the proceedings at the International Court of Justice must be allowed to proceed without political interference, reinforcing the principle that no one is above the law. This new approach also necessitates a move beyond simply facilitating negotiations between the parties and toward proposing and backing a clear framework for a solution. Given the immense power imbalance and the profound lack of trust, the parties are unlikely to reach a solution on their own. The international community, perhaps through the Quartet, the United States, the European Union, the United Nations, and Russia, or a new coalition of concerned states, should table a detailed bridging proposal based on established international parameters. This would include defined borders based on the 1967 lines with land swaps, a solution for Jerusalem, security arrangements, and a just resolution for refugees. This provides a concrete political horizon to work towards. Ultimately, the international community must make it clear that the alternative to a negotiated two-state solution is not a continuation of the status quo, but a reality that will be increasingly unacceptable to the world. If a two-state solution is made impossible by continued settlement expansion, the world will increasingly view the situation as a single state with unequal rights, a de facto apartheid system. This would lead to Israel's growing isolation, sanctions, and the loss of its democratic identity. By clearly articulating the starkness of this choice, the international community can create urgency and impress upon Israeli leaders and society that ending the occupation is not a concession to the Palestinians, but an essential act of self-preservation. The path forward, as outlined in this analysis, is undeniably fraught with immense difficulty and requires an extraordinary degree of political courage from leaders on all sides. It also demands a willingness from both the Israeli and Palestinian peoples to make significant and emotionally painful sacrifices. The work of peace is not for the faint of heart. It involves confronting deeply held historical grievances and national narratives. Israelis will have to accept the profound strategic and psychological shift of ending the entire settlement enterprise and withdrawing their military and civilian presence from the vast majority of the West Bank. This means dismantling not just small, illegal outposts, but established towns, uprooting communities, and fundamentally redrawing the map of their national imagination. For Palestinians, the compromises are equally challenging and cut to the core of their identity and historical struggle. They must formally and finally accept the permanent existence of the State of Israel as a Jewish state within the Middle East, relinquishing the dream of a single secular state in all of historic Palestine. Furthermore, they must accept a pragmatic and just solution to the refugee issue that acknowledges the demographic realities of Israel, meaning that the right of return will be realized primarily through resettlement in the new state of Palestine and compensation, not through a mass return to homes inside Israel. This requires a painful reckoning with the limits of what is possible in order to achieve the tangible reality of an independent state. The greatest challenge will be for both peoples to choose and empower leaders who are willing and able to make these difficult generational decisions. In the current climate of extreme polarization, anger, and mistrust, any leader advocating for such consequences will inevitably be branded as a traitor by rejecting those factors on the other side. Therefore, it's not enough for leaders to simply sign an agreement. They must have the political strength and conviction to stand behind them, to sell their skin and to withstand the inevitable This is the true meaning of leadership in this context, the ability to guide one's people away from the seductive comfort of familiar grievances and toward the uncertain and arduous work of reconciliation. The alternative to this kind of courageous leadership is not a stable status quo, but a continued and accelerating descent into a dark reality that serves the long-term interests of neither people. The choice is not between a perfect peace in the current situation, but between an imperfect, negotiated peace and a future of endless war, dispossession, and mutual destruction that will bleed for generations to come, consuming the very soul of both nations. The urgency of this choice is amplified by a stark and unavoidable reality that Akiva Eldar has consistently highlighted for many years: the demographic reality on the ground. When you look at the single geographic entity between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea, the number of Palestinians and Israeli Jews is now roughly equal at around 7 million each. Current projections indicate that, due to higher Palestinian birth rates, Palestinians are likely to become the majority population in this combined territory within the next decade. This demographic fact cannot be wished away, ignored, or managed indefinitely. It forces a fundamental and existential choice upon the state of Israel about its future character and identity. This demographic reality makes the two-state solution not just a moral imperative based on principles of justice and self-determination, but a practical and existential necessity for Israel's survival as both a Jewish and a democratic state. If Israel continues to rule over millions of Palestinians in an occupied territory without granting them political rights, as the Palestinian population becomes the majority, Israel will cease to be a democracy. It will become, by definition, a minority-run state, forced to govern a majority that is disenfranchised. This is a path that leads directly to the international definition of apartheid and to becoming a pariah state in the eyes of the world. The alternative trajectories are equally unacceptable to the core aspirations of both peoples. A single binational state, while appealing to some on the idealistic left, would in all likelihood not be a peaceful union, but a recipe for perpetual civil strife and instability, as two national movements with competing narratives and deep-seated animosity vie for control. The other alternative, permanent occupation, would force Israel to make a terrible choice. It could remain a Jewish state by formally denying rights to a Palestinian majority, thereby sacrificing its democracy, or it could remain a democracy by granting all Palestinians the right to vote, thereby sacrificing its identity as a Jewish majority state. This is the heart of the matter, the window of opportunity for creating a viable two-state solution, which allows Israel to separate from the Palestinians and thus preserve its Jewish and democratic character, is rapidly closing. The relentless expansion of settlements is creating a one-state reality on the ground that may soon become irreversible. The demographic clock is ticking loudly, and it is a clock that does not favor those who believe in maintaining the status quo. Immediate and decisive action toward a two-state partition is therefore not just a policy preference, it is an act of strategic self-preservation for the Zionist project itself. Official, top-down diplomacy alone will never be sufficient to bridge the enormous psychological and political gaps that exist between Israelis and Palestinians. The distrust is just too deep, the trauma is too raw, and the narratives are frankly too divergent. Therefore, civil society organizations, grassroots movements, religious leaders, and the business communities on both sides must play an active and indispensable role in preparing their respective publics for the difficult compromises that peace will inevitably require. Peace cannot be imposed from above. It must be cultivated from the ground up, nurtured in the soil of shared human experience and mutual interest, creating a constituency for reconciliation. Track 2, do diplomacy initiatives, which bring together former officials, academics, community leaders, and other non-governmental figures from both sides, have consistently proven their value. In these informal settings, away from the glare of media and political posturing, creative and pragmatic solutions to even the most intractable issues like Jerusalem or refugees have been developed. These initiatives must be significantly expanded, funded, and supported by the international community. Particular emphasis should be placed on efforts that engage the younger generations, the very people who will inherit the consequences of today's decisions, and who must build the future peace together. Educational reform represents another crucial, long-term element in the work of peace. The educational systems on both sides must be gradually and carefully reformed to promote a more nuanced understanding of the other's history, culture, and national narrative, while still maintaining a firm commitment to each people's own legitimate identity and aspirations. This does not mean creating false equivalencies or forcing an artificial narrative. It means fostering critical thinking and empathy, acknowledging that both peoples have legitimate grievances, have suffered immense pain, and both deserve justice and security. It is about humanizing the other in the minds of the next generation. Finally, the economic dimensions of peace offer one of the most promising avenues for building tangible trust and demonstrating the real-world benefits of cooperation over conflict. The Palestinian economy, which has been devastated by decades of occupation and war, requires massive international investment and, crucially, integration with the Israeli, regional, and global markets. A thriving Palestinian economy would not only improve living standards and create hope, it would also give millions of ordinary people a real stake in maintaining peace. Joint ventures and regional economic projects can create interdependencies that make conflict more costly and cooperation more profitable for everyone involved. The path outlined in this analysis, drawing heavily from the incisive and morally clear perspective of Akiva Eldar, is not an easy one. It is a route that demands enormous political courage from leaders on all sides and a profound willingness to undertake significant, painful sacrifices from both the Israeli and Palestinian peoples. Israelis must confront the deeply held ideology of the settlement enterprise, accepting the necessity of withdrawing from most of the West Bank to allow for a viable Palestinian state. This involves not only a strategic shift, but a psychological one, letting go of a territorial dream held by a powerful segment of the nation. This is a sacrifice for the greater good of a secure, democratic, and Jewish state. For their part, Palestinians must make equally momentous and emotionally wrenching compromises. This includes the formal acceptance of Israel's permanent existence as the homeland of the Jewish people, a move that requires relinquishing the long-held claim to all of historic Palestine. It also means accepting a just and pragmatic resolution to the refugee issue that respects Israel's demographic realities, with the right of return being fulfilled primarily through compensation and resettlement in the new Palestinian state. Both peoples must find it within themselves to elect and support leaders who are brave enough to make these difficult decisions and to defend them against the inevitable backlash from extremists who thrive on the continuation of the conflict. The alternative to summoning this immense courage is a continued and likely accelerated descent into a grim reality that ultimately serves the interests of neither people. The current trajectory, if left unaltered, leads directly toward one of two catastrophic outcomes. The first is a system of permanent apartheid, where a Jewish minority rules over a Palestinian majority, a situation that is morally indefensible, internationally condemned, and ultimately unsustainable. The second is a future of endless, escalating cycles of violence, with each generation consumed by more bloodshed, trauma, and hatred than the last. The status quo is not static. It is a downward spiral into a dark abyss. History will undoubtedly judge this generation of leaders and citizens with unforgiving harshness if, when presented with this stark choice and this narrow window of opportunity, they choose the temporary and false comfort of their familiar grievances over the difficult, necessary work of reconciliation and compromise. The time for such self-indulgent comfort has long passed, burned away in the fires of October 7th and the subsequent devastation in Gaza. The work of building peace, as arduous and painful as it may be, represents the only path toward a livable, secure, and dignified future for both the peoples who share this small, contested, and holy piece of land they both call home. Akiva Eldar's perspective, while often controversial within mainstream Israeli society for its unflinching and relentless criticism of the occupation, provides the essential moral clarity and intellectual honesty that this moment so desperately requires. His analysis is not born from animosity toward his country, but from a deep and abiding love for it. This love compels him to recognize that genuine patriotism requires confronting uncomfortable truths about the nation's current path, and possessing the courage to advocate for a different direction while there is still time to change course. It is an argument that Israel's soul is at stake, and that saving it requires ending the domination over another people. The horrific attacks of October 7th and their devastating aftermath have created a new, brutal reality that makes all previous assumptions and strategies completely obsolete. The old paradigms of managing the conflict, of believing in technological fixes for political problems, and of sidelining the Palestinian issue have been shattered beyond repair. Yet, within the depths of this unprecedented crisis lies a unique and perhaps final opportunity to finally address the fundamental, existential issues that all previous peace processes have either avoided or failed to resolve. The questions of borders, Jerusalem, refugees, and security must be tackled head-on, with creativity and a genuine will to find workable solutions. The choice now facing both peoples is as stark and as clear as it has ever been. They can either summon the collective courage to make the historic compromises that a lasting peace requires, or they can continue down the well-trodden path that promises only more suffering, more loss, and more despair for both sides. It is a choice between a future of shared possibility and a future of mutual ruin. It demands that pragmatism triumph over ideology, that the desire for a better life for one's children overcomes the thirst for historical vindication or revenge. It is a choice that cannot be postponed any longer, as the ground is crumbling beneath the feet of both nations. This is a moment that calls for a new kind of leadership, one defined not by military prowess or fiery rhetoric, but by empathy, wisdom, and the moral courage to speak difficult truths to one's own people. It requires leaders who can see beyond the next election cycle and envision a future a generation from now, and who are willing to risk their political careers to build a bridge to that future. The cost of inaction is measured in the lives of children, both Israeli and Palestinian, who deserve to grow up free from the shadow of this relentless conflict. The responsibility to act rests heavily on the shoulders of the present generation. What is ultimately at stake is the very nature of the future that will be bequeathed to the next generation. Will it be a future defined by ever higher walls, more sophisticated bomb shelters, and the constant fear of violence? Or will it be a future where children from both nations can grow up with a sense of security, opportunity, and hope? The decisions made in the coming months and years will answer this question. The current path leads inexorably towards more walls and more fear. Only a bold and dramatic change of course can offer the possibility of a different outcome, one where mutual recognition and respect replace mutual hatred and suspicion. The international community must also rise to the occasion, abandoning the failed policies of the past and embracing a more active and determined role. This means applying consistent pressure, providing meaningful incentives, and upholding international law for all parties without fear or favor. The United States in particular has a unique responsibility to use its influence to guide its ally, Israel, toward a path that ensures its long-term security as a democratic and Jewish state, which can only be achieved through a two-state solution. It also means empowering and supporting a reformed and legitimate Palestinian leadership that can be a credible partner for peace and an effective governor for its people. The work of peace is not solely the domain of politicians and diplomats. It must be a societal project driven by civil society, educators, business leaders, and ordinary citizens on both sides who are brave enough to reach across the divide. It requires building relationships, fostering dialogue, and creating shared interests that can form the bedrock of a durable peace. It means teaching children empathy instead of hatred, and showing them that the other is not a monolithic monster but a human being with similar dreams and fears. This grassroots work is essential to create a culture of peace that can sustain any political agreement. In the final analysis, the choice is one between hope and despair, between creation and destruction. The path of continued conflict is a path of nihilism, one that offers no victory, only endless cycles of grieving. The path of peace, however difficult, is one that affirms life and the possibility of a shared future. It is a testament to the belief that even after decades of bitterness and bloodshed, reconciliation is possible. For the sake of all the children who share that small piece of land, for the sake of the future of both peoples, and for the sake of the moral conscience of the world, the choice for peace must be made.